In this video, I want to weave something that looks like water and then needle felt a swan on top of it. So let's get started. Spring has finally mostly arrived, and with that has come the swans. I have seen so many swans lately in our area, and so I really want to make something that has a swan on it. The first thing I'm going to need to do is create some yarn that hopefully looks like water. Now, I don't want this to be a typical bright blue type of water. I want it to read a little bit more vintage oil painting. So I'm going to go through my wool and grab some teals, some blues, and even some greens to sort of represent trees reflecting onto the water to create this yarn. To create this yarn, I'm taking my drum carder, which I'll link in the description box below. Personally, I love the results of painting small pieces of the wool directly onto the drum of my drum carder to create my bat that I'm going to spin. I really like creating my bat this way because I feel like it has an even amount of colors throughout, but they're not perfectly even, so it's not going to be a variegated yarn where the colors are all perfectly spaced out. It's going to be a bit more random, but still feel cohesive in the end. But I think that this works so well for more landscape inspired pieces because nature is never perfect. And I love the way that the yarn has some areas where the colors stand out more than others, and it creates a really beautiful effect. After finishing up creating the bat, I took it off of my drum carder and then I started splitting it up into smaller pieces and pre-drafting it. I find that this just makes the whole process a lot easier and faster for me, so that's how I do it. And then I grabbed my electric e-spinner. Again, I'll link that down in the description box below. So to spin this yarn, I'm using a core of worsted weight wool yarn. This particular one is Briggs & Little Heritage. I just picked one. I have quite a few colors of this, and I picked the one that seemed to match closest to my bat. So I'm spinning in the direction that the yarn is spun, so it's actually making that yarn spin up a little tighter, and then I'll be plying in the opposite direction. So I'm just core spinning this yarn, not making it super perfect. Some areas are thicker, some areas are thinner. Again, this is the way I really like it because it helps the piece to look more organic, which is perfect because most of the pieces I use my hand spun yarn for are nature inspired. So I, again, really like the natural texture of sort of a thick and thin spun yarn. Now that I'm done doing the core spinning, I'm going to start plying. So I'm using a thin cotton string and I'm spiral plying the core spun yarn over top of it. So once again, you'll see even more now that there's going to be spots that are thicker and some spots that are thinner, really providing a beautiful texture. It disperses the color in a really nice way, and it doesn't give me a stripy look. For what I'm using this yarn for, I don't ever really want a striped look, so that's why I just really love spiral plying. Here's the result of the yarn, and now we're ready to get started with weaving. All right, for my weaving, I'm going to be using our Spruce & Linen regular sized flat pack frame loom, and I'm going to grab my 412 linen warp string. So here's what the linen warp string looks like. I absolutely love the color and texture of linen warp string, hence the name of Spruce & Linen. Now I need to decide how I'm putting this on the loom, how big it's going to be, and all of that. I've already cut my dowel, which is 8 3/4 inches wide, and I wanted my weaving to be about 8 inches wide. So if I do 8 there, and I have this in the bottom, so I'm just kind of mapping out here. And I think what I can do, you may have noticed that recently I've been weaving some pieces upside down so that I have the perfect amount of warp string at what is the top of the piece for my dowel. Now in this case, I actually don't really need to do that because if I look at this and I have my cardstock that goes in the bottom of my piece, and then I weave about 8 inches. I'm left with basically the same amount at the top. So I'm actually gonna weave this one from bottom up this time, which means I'm going to need to decide what I wanna do for the fringe now, because we're gonna be doing all that base work first. Sometimes my instinct is just to go with the white yarn, but for something that is more water inspired, you know, maybe there's a different option. So I'm gonna go look at my options and meet you back here with what I decide. All right, I've grabbed a couple of options and I wanna decide which one I think would look nicer with this yarn. So I have this lighter blue option, and at first I thought maybe this is too bright and maybe I should grab my dowel as well. So this is going to be my dowel. And then of course we do have the linen warp string that's gonna be, you know, going over top of the dowel. And then here's our yarn. And this is one option that I have. I do actually think this would look really pretty, but it's just a matter of if I want that higher contrast versus lower contrast. So this is more of a, I don't even know, like maybe a powder blue. It's a very cool blue. And then I also have this more muted teal color. It's a hard decision because I'm wanting to go with that vibe that feels a little bit more like a vintage oil painting would. And so I don't want to go too bright, but I don't know if this is too bright. And then there is the option that I could mix colors, but sometimes I find that that makes my fringe feel too busy, especially when I already have a yarn that has a lot of color variation as it is. I think having the bottom fringe just be simple might feel a little bit better. Just want to pull some off of here and really look at it against the yarn as if it was fringe. So that's kind of what this would look like. I'm actually feeling like it doesn't quite go because there's nothing that in this yarn that is quite this color. That's hard. Okay, that's that option. And I do have a weaving that has blue fringe, so I might just pick that up. So I'm actually just going to, maybe I can just sort of cover up the actual woven section so I'm not distracted by it. And then maybe what we can do is just sort of lay out the yarn. Oh, that is quite nice. So that's what the light blue would look like. I might need to take a picture. And then this is option 2. All right, I'm bringing in a third option because I can't quite decide. I feel the teal maybe doesn't quite go with what I'm envisioning what else would be in the vicinity. Actually, so this is a piece I made a couple weeks ago that also has the green yarn, or sorry, the green fringe. So I'm wanting to see if perhaps the green would look nice. And actually, I think I quite like that. And the reasoning I think I like it is that it's reading a little bit like it could be the grass at the end of a pond or whatever other greenery would be there. Okay, take a picture of that. All right, I've mulled it over and I think I want to go with the blue. There's something I really like about it as a contrast with the yarn, but there is still a similar color in the yarn. You can see it right here. I feel like there's something about this that brightens up the piece, and even if the green makes more sense in the context of it being kind of a landscape, I think the blue might just be more fun. So let's give it a try. So to get started with warping my loom, I'm tying an overhand knot in my warp string to create a loop. And I've already mapped this out on how it fits on my loom nicely. So I'm going to start on the 3rd groove in on my loom, do the same thing at the top, and then I'm going to be single warping a total of 32 warp strings. And this is a 4 ends per inch loom. Now that I have 32 warp strings on my loom, I cut off the end of my warp string, leaving a nice long tail, and now I'm just going to knot this back around. I always try to keep the tension on that last string while I do this so that we don't have one string that's way looser than the others. Now that I have my warp string on my loom, I'm going to take my cardstock. This one is about 3 1/8 inches, but approximately 3 1/4 is good. And I'm just going to weave this in with plain weave. So under one, over one, all the way across my loom. I want my fringe to be approximately half the length of my weaving, and I know that's around 8, but I need to account for the knots that are created as well. So I'm going to try just cutting one piece of this fringe string at 10 inches and see where that gets me once I actually do a knot. Now I will be doing 2 strands, not just one, but if I do that and I kind of sit it up like this, ignore that it doesn't want to sit right now, that'll get better. So that does give me more than 4 inches. So I can probably go closer to 9. Let's try it at 9. I do want my fringe to be slightly longer than 4 inches just because I may have to trim it. And usually I do because it's not perfectly even. So that gives me a little bit of extra. So I'm happy with that. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut 32 of my fringe yarns at 9 inches. Lately, I have been cutting these fringe yarns at a very imprecise length because I wanted the uneven look, but I was finding that I was getting a little bit too willy-nilly with that. And so I'm going to go a little bit more even on this one. And then if I want to cut them at slightly different lengths once they're on the piece, I can do that. Okay, so now I have all of my fringe cut and ready to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and tape down my loom and then start on the base work for this piece. For the base work, I'm grabbing this super bulky weight yarn that just happens to mostly match with my fringe yarn. I always like to try to use a color similar to the fringe for the base work because if you see it a little bit in the bottom, it's not going to stand out very much. So what I'm gonna do is a twining stitch followed by probably 2 to 3 rows of plain weave. I was thinking I might do 3 rows of plain weave, but I don't think I need it. So I'm just gonna leave it at 2. And then I'm going to weave this tail back in just a few warp strings so that I can tuck it into the middle instead of on the side, and then just trim off the excess, which leaves me a bit of a tail in the back to tuck in later. Now I can start on my fringe. So I'm grabbing 2 pieces of my fringe at a time, and I'm going to be using a raya knot to tie the fringe around 2 strings at a time. Now that I'm done the fringe, I'm going to be weaving this over 2 under 2. I like the way that it hides the warp strings because I really want the hand spun yarn to shine. And the other thing that it helps with is that it doesn't get quite as agitated when I weave it over 2 under 2 as it would if I did it over 1 under 1 with this particular warp set. Another thing you can do when you're weaving with yarns like this one and you're not wanting them to get as agitated is you can weave with a shed stick. Now, another thing you can use is a ruler, as long as it doesn't have super sharp edges, so that it doesn't risk cutting your warp strings. And you could also use a painter stick, something like that would work great for this as well. The one thing I'll note is that the further you get into your weaving, the closer to the top, you're gonna have to stop using your shed stick because it has a potential to really be pulling on the notches of your loom quite a bit. And as you can see, I can't even quite open it. Now you could still use it and just kind of only partially open it and pass your needle through that way. When you're down here, you can lift it all the way up and creating that shed to pass your needle through. So I'm probably gonna try that today, is just sort of when I get to the top, only lift it a little bit and just use one hand to pass my needle through, and we'll see how that goes. At the top of the piece, to finish this off, I'm doing a twining stitch, and I did weave that twining stitch over 1 under 1 for the plain weave part, and then the twining over top of that. It's just going to make it a bit tighter at the top, which worked really well. Now I'm flipping over my loom and I'm tucking in all of the ends so I don't have to worry about those later. All right, so we're at the part where I'm going to start needle felting. And what I've done is I actually printed out a swan I found on Canva, and you'll have to ignore the color that the swan printed because something is wrong with my printer. But I wanted to do this so that I could figure out the size that I wanted my swan before starting it, because if you remember the last video when I did the needle felted cat, I made it so small and it was just really giving me a lot of trouble. So I wanted to make sure I made this one a bit bigger so that hopefully it's more enjoyable to needle felt. So I did it at about 3 inches wide, and I think it's almost 3 inches tall as well. And that just feels like a really good size. And then I cut it out of here. So I have a stencil to use, but also I was able to use the actual cutout swan to visualize what this is going to look like on the actual piece. I do like the idea, much like with the cat piece, where I'm kind of putting it in the bottom third of the piece. It just feels really nice to me. Putting it smack dab in the middle doesn't feel as nice to me. Now, in the case where I was gonna do several swans, then I would probably try to strategically place them and do different sizes. But for this one, I just want to do one because, again, I do really want a lot of that yarn showing because it's really pretty, if I can say so myself. And I want that to be, you know, a large part of this piece. So I'm gonna grab my needle felting stuff, and I'll link all the tools and materials that I can in the description box below. I'm gonna put my needle felting pad under where I'm going to be working, and I'm just gonna use this stencil to at least kind of eyeball where I need to put the wool. I might not use this stencil for very long, but it should help me get this started. So I'm gonna set this here, make sure I like the placement, and then I can set this on top. And I might actually just want to grab some paper scissors and make a snip there, because it'd be easier if I knew where the paper lined up. So if I know that the bottom of the paper lines up with the top of the fringe and then the side with the side, that would be a lot easier. So I'm just gonna fold this over actually, and just make sure that that looks approximately good. And I think that looks great. So I'm gonna start with just a natural color wool. And another issue that came up with the cat as well, I'm gonna keep referencing it because as I make pieces, I try to bring in some of the challenges from the last one into the new one and be like, what can I improve from the last time I did something similar? So I'm gonna grab some natural wool. This is merino wool roving, and I'm going to be using that for my needle felting. And I'm grabbing the undyed off-white color, which is honestly so perfect for something like a swan, because while swans look very white, they're definitely like a softer white, not a bright white. So this is gonna be perfect for that. And then I need to decide how thick I want this to be. I do want it to be semi on the thick side, and then I'll add some detail over top of it later. But again, I have in the past with the cat run into not putting enough wool down, and then it feels a little bit too thin, almost like the yarn behind it is gonna start to show through. Try to tuck these ends in a little bit. And I think I'm just gonna start needle felting. And I might have to add another layer on this yet. I won't really know until I get into it. And one thing I'm always doing when I'm needle felting into a pad behind it is every once in a while I'm just gonna lift it up off of that pad so that I'm not completely needle felting it into there. All right, I'm gonna do the whole base of this swan, and then we can get started with adding some detail for the beak and the eye and defining those wings a little more as well. All right, so I've spent quite a bit of time getting the main part of the swan done, and I think it looks pretty good. So I actually used a combination of the stencil as well as the cutout. So I first started with the stencil and did a bunch of needle felting that way, but then I realized I couldn't really see beyond the lines here, obviously. So that's when I pulled out the cutout portion, and I was able to sort of use that to get the outline a little bit cleaner. And you know, there's still a little bit more I can do. And the thing about needle felting and me is it feels like it's never quite done. But I think I'm at a good point now where I can start to add some of the details. So there are just these really small little details that I think would be nice to add that define the areas of the wings. And I think this particular graphic or illustration that I was able to find has them done in a really simple way, which I think lends itself well to needle felting. And then obviously I also still need to add the beak and finish the head. I might need to add more white yet, but essentially what I'm gonna do is I might actually, you know, what I might actually do before adding in the orange is just sort of flatten out this area with my needle felting a little bit so that hopefully the beak doesn't just sort of sink down into here. I'll probably have to make the beak kind of thick, just as I did the main part of the swan, so that it doesn't, again, just disappear into the yarn. So for the beak, I'm gonna be using more of an orange than a yellow. I need to pick which orange I want to do the beak in. I'm thinking this one. That one feels kind of good. The other option I have is a little bit darker. Actually, I kind of want to look at a real picture of a swan. Yeah, I think I'm gonna go with a lighter orange. It just feels right. Now I might want to use my stencil again for this part, because sometimes it can feel like, where am I even needle felting? I'm definitely finding that a stencil is such a game changer, because I don't know, I don't know about you guys, but I don't love drawing. And so I feel like I'm lacking a bit of experience in like just freehanding, especially an animal kind of shape. So this stencil is making this so much easier, and I'm enjoying it more because of that. I'm not sort of just guessing where things should go. I can see pretty clearly where it needs to be. So if you're creating something like this and you find that to be a bit of a struggle, I definitely recommend this, because all you need is just to be able to print it out, or you could trace it onto paper and then you can cut it out. I just used a little, like a really skinny X-Acto knife and a cutting mat to cut it out. And yeah, it's just making this process much easier. Do you need to bring that in? And this is where I can use this part of the cutout now to just get those outlines nice and more precise. It's amazing how already too, just adding that bit of a beak is making it look more like a swan. After finishing the main shape of the swan, I started working on the details. So I added that beak as well as the black part over the beak and then the eye. And then it was time to try to add some details for the wings. I was using a reference, that same reference I had shown you earlier that I had gotten off of Canva. So I was just trying to use that as a general guide to the details I could add. I used a really dark grayish color to first start adding lines, and then that felt really harsh, but it was just the first layer. And I think that's something to keep in mind when you are needle felting, that you can work in layers, much like with paint. So I started with the darkest color, I added some light beige, and then I ended up adding some brown as well. And this just sort of softened everything, but still gave it that definition to make sure you kind of can tell that there was wings on the bird and it wasn't just a swan outline. I worked on this for quite a while, and as per usual with needle felting, it's sometimes hard to know when to stop, but I felt like it was an okay time to stop, so I started working on the finishings. First, I pulled out that cardstock and I knotted up all the warp strings on the bottom, and then I sewed them back into the piece. And then after that, it was time to add the dowel. I just used lark's head knots to attach the weaving to the dowel. So I'm using that dowel that I cut. It's about 8 3/4 inches wide and 7/8 of an inch thick. And I did stain it, that's why it's this darker brown color. I added a hanging string using the same color as the warp string. I always think that ties in really nicely. And then the last thing I did was clean up the fringe, just trimming it so it was kind of generally the same length. I try not to be too picky about this because I do think it looks nice when it's not perfect on the bottom. All right, it's all done, so let's have a look at the finished piece. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you like the blue fringe, or do you think I should have gone with the green? If you enjoyed this video, check out this one next.